A lot of the times I'll see comments from new players asking about particular cards and why they don't see very much play. So in this list, we're going to go over 10 cards that seem really good at first glance to newer players, but don't really see much competitive play for various reasons. And at number 10, we have the 5-headed dragon. This is a fusion monster with 5,000 attack and defense, the highest attack point value in the game that a monster can have, and simply requires any 5 monsters as its materials, and can't be destroyed by battle with certain attributes of monsters, with the restriction where this card must be fusion summoned. Now, I'm sure most people realize why this card isn't very good immediately, and it's not too hard to see why this card doesn't see competitive play. It requires 5 monsters as materials, and its effects on field aren't really that impressive, or having battle immunity for certain types of monsters isn't super useful on a monster with 5,000 attack. However, you may be quick to mention cards like Future Fusion and Dragon's Mirror, which will allow you to bring out the card much easier. Future Fusion allows you to fusion summon a monster using cards from your deck and could potentially allow you to send any 5 dragons from your deck to the graveyard. However, Future Fusion received an errata where it won't actually send any cards from your deck to the graveyard until the following turn after you activate it, giving your opponent a full turn to destroy the card, which is pretty easy to do in the modern meta. But pre-errata, Future Fusion used to send the cards immediately from your deck to the graveyard, and that's why the card was banned, because that was actually very good. Especially if combo with something like 5-headed dragon to get a whole bunch of graveyard dragon effects set up. There's also Dragon's Mirror that allows you to banish 5 dragons from your graveyard to bring it out. The thing is, it's actually kinda difficult to set up 5 materials in your graveyard, and if you're going through the effort to set up so many monsters, usually there should be a better payoff than a 5,000 vanilla beatstick. There is also the option of using Greater Polymerization, which will grant it immunity to destruction effects and piercing damage, since it's a fusion monster that requires more than 3 materials. Although Greater Polymerization requires you to use monsters from your hand or field, so it's inherently a -5 in card advantage to bring out 5-headed dragon, and that is definitely not worth the effort for just adding destruction immunity on top of it, although it can be fun in a gimmick deck. And at number 9, we have everybody's favorite ritual monster, the Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon. Now, this card did actually see some competitive play, although that was definitely in the past, and some of the other cards on this list saw some competitive play in the past as well, but they're definitely way past their prime. This is a 4,000 attack ritual monster, which has the effect where it can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects, and if it attacks a defensive monster, it deals double piercing battle damage. So if you give your opponent a 0 defense monster with creature swap, you can deal 8,000 points of damage if you attack into it with your Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon. So, having destruction and target immunity is a good form of protection. And having 4,000 attack makes it unlikely to be destroyed by battle very easily. However, it's not that difficult for the average meta deck to actually out Max Dragon, as 2 very common extra deck monsters are able to just beat it in battle no problem. The thing is though, if Chaos Max Dragon was just a little bit easier to bring out, it wouldn't be half bad, because the card is pretty decent. One of the main things holding Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon back is that its ritual spell card does not mention its name specifically. Chaos Form has the ability to ritual summon this card by tributing monsters from your hand or field, or it allows you to banish a Blue Eyes White Dragon from your graveyard in order to ritual summon Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon from your hand. But Chaos Form does not specifically mention Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon in its text, and simply says it can be used to ritual summon any Chaos or Blackluster Soldier ritual monster. And this is the distinction that matters, because one of the best singular pieces of ritual support is pre-preparation of rites. This card has the effect to add a ritual spell and a ritual monster from your deck to your hand, just as long as the ritual's monster's name is specifically listed in that ritual spell card. So it's a straight +1 in card advantage, in one of the best ways possible of allowing you to search those specific cards from your deck. And because pre-preparation rites is so good, it kind of gives a boost to any ritual monsters that are specifically listed in their good ritual spell cards. Although, just not being a pre-preparation of rites target isn't the worst thing in the world. It's the fact that it also has a very high attack point value of 4,000. You see, they also released a whole archetype of support for ritual monsters called the Drytrons, and they have one of the best ritual spell cards in the game called the Meteonis Drytron, which allows you to ritual summon a ritual monster from either your hand or graveyard by tributing machine-type monsters from your hand or field, whose total attacks equal or exceed the ritual monster you're trying to bring out. And because it uses attack point values instead of levels, Meteonis allows you to cheat out some very powerful ritual monsters like Herald of Ultimateness, and a whole bunch of other ritual monsters, but you'll always have to use 2 cards if you want to bring out Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, because it has 4,000 attack baseline. Now, it's not impossible to use with Drytron. The Drytron ritual monsters themselves have 4,000 attack even, but they're also better to use than Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, if you're going to go to the effort of using 2 Drytrons to go into them. So because of a combination of having a bad ritual spell card that doesn't list its name specifically, and having too high of an attack point value, it doesn't gel very well with modern ritual support. And rituals are so inherently bad that they need to be almost broken in order to see competitive play, which Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon is not broken enough to reach that threshold, especially not in the modern meta. And at number 8, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra. This is one of the few monsters in the game that has the Divine Beast type and Divine Attribute, and was a very popular overpowered card in the anime, which has an effect which seems like it's pretty good. It requires 3 monsters for its tribute summon, your opponent can't negate the tribute summon, and when it's summoned, you pay life points and you only have 100 left in order to give this card attack and defense equal to the amount of life points you paid. And lastly, you can pay 1000 life points to destroy 1 monster in the field on an effect that's not once per turn. So if you have a full 8000 life points and you bring out the Winged Dragon of Ra, it will have 7900 attack and defense, which is definitely enough to beat over pretty much any monster in the game. So here's the problem with this card. Outside of its summon not being able to be negated, it has absolutely 0 protection. If your opponent activates something like Infinite Impermanence on your Winged Dragon of Ra, its attack will be reset down to 0 and you don't gain your life points back, so you're just stuck at 100. Also, you can only pay multiples so that you have 100 left and not just any amount of life points you want. So summoning the card and using the effect is always going to put you in a very risky position unless you just don't use the effect to gain any attack points. And if you do use the effect to gain attack points, you can't use its other effect to destroy monsters because you won't have any life points left. So if your opponent just has any form of disruption at all, they can easily target the Winged Dragon of Ra and get rid of it, since just lightly breathing on the card will reset its attack point value or get rid of it. And since it requires so many resources to hit the field in the first place, it's usually a good idea to just save your forms of disruption for when the Winged Dragon of Ra comes out. In fact, the card was so bad that they released 6 support cards which exist solely to give it some of its effects back from the anime, which would actually make the monster more useful. And at number 7, we have Chainsaw Insect. This is a level 4 monster with 2400 attack, which has the effect where at the end of the damage step of this card battled, your opponent draws a card. Now, 2400 attack on a level 4 monster is really high. That's one of the highest values of a level 4 monster in the game. So if you get Chainsaw Insect on the field, chances are you'll be able to beat over any of your opponent's level 4 or lower monsters, and even a lot of their other normal low attack boss monsters. And the cost for this is just your opponent drawing 1 card, so you can attack with it all you want without having to worry about too much of the downside. The problem though, is that giving your opponent card draw is one of the worst effects in the game, because card advantage in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is everything. In other card games, they usually have a resource system which will inherently limit how many actions you're able to perform in a turn. So cards that allow you to draw other cards in other card games are usually not that big a deal, even if the effects are still definitely good nonetheless. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Though, a single card draw is so good that we have cards like Chicken Game banned because they allow you to draw a single card and can be used too easily. A singular card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can kind of win you the game on its own because of all of the combos it can allow you to perform, or just because there's a lot of super powerful singular cards in the game. So giving your opponent any kind of card draw better be worth that effect. There's a card called Dark Bribe, which allows you to negate any spell or trap card at the cost of giving your opponent a +1 draw, and that card is considered not very good and only played in very niche situations, like Mystic Mind stall decks, and even then, it isn't considered that great of an option compared to other alternatives. So having a monster with the same detriments is obviously even worse, because your opponent can proc the effect by attacking into it as well, which is definitely worth it because of how valuable that card draw is. And at number 6, we have Dances with Beasts. This is a trap card which has the effect where if an opponent declares a direct attack, while the combined attack of all face-up monsters they control is 8000 or higher, you can summon 3 monsters with different original names. 1 from your deck, 1 from your hand, and 1 from your graveyard. So, being able to get out a card from your deck and graveyard out of those 3 is really good, especially since it's completely unconditional on what your targets are. If one of your targets is something like Thunderclap Skywolf, it can use its effect on your opponent's turn to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. And modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all about accumulating a huge board of monsters that can easily have over 8000 attack. So the effect will probably be live more often than you'd think. However, the big problem with the card is the fact that it's a battle trap, whose trigger is a direct attack and not an attack on one of your monsters. There's another card in the game called Drowning Mirror Force, which can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack as well, and it shuffles all of your opponent's monsters back into the deck. And the effect of returning monsters back to the deck is one of the strongest forms of removal in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it prevents a lot of floating effects. And Drowning Mirror Force sees almost no play in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, although it is heavily played in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. Dances with Beast has an even harsher restriction of also requiring your opponent to control a lot of high attack monsters. And the reason these effects are not very good is because modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about destroying your opponent's board before entering the battle phase at all. So basically any battle trap, no matter how good it is just a sitting duck for your opponent's destruction effects. And that's why cards like Torrential Tribute are a lot more valuable, because they can be activated outside of the battle phase and during the process of your opponent establishing their board, which would be able to destroy your back row. And at number 5, we have Shard of Greed. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where each time you draw a card for your normal draw phase, you get to place 1 greed counter on this card. Then, once this card has 2 or more greed counters, you can send it to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. So the card is basically Pot of Greed that takes 2 turns in order to activate. And Pot of Greed is one of the best singular cards in the game because it just gives you an effortless +1. And as I've talked about in the Chainsaw Insect section, being able to draw cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very good compared to other card games. So having a generic draw 2 card that just takes 2 turns to activate sounds like a no-brainer good card. The problem, though, is the same problem as the previous card, in that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all about destroying your opponent's board before entering the battle phase, and Shard of Greed is basically a sitting target waiting to get destroyed by basically anything. It's just too vulnerable and doesn't offer you the immediate advantage that would be necessary in order to be played in a combo deck that might want generic card draw. If you're playing an incredibly slow control deck, you also kind of want your effects to do something immediately, because you're playing against your opponent's combo deck that's trying to destroy all your cards. So control decks definitely value cards that are able to stop their opponent's plays, and not cards that take up one of their card draws and waits 2 turns before being useful. So it's not really useful in combo decks since they need to be able to use everything immediately, or control decks that are trying to survive against combo decks destroying their field. And at number 4, we have Witch's Strike. Witch's Strike is a trap card which has the effect that it can only be activated in response to your opponent negating either the summon of one of your monsters, or the activation of one of your cards or effects, in which case you gain the effect to destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. So basically, if you activate the effect, you gain so much advantage from the destruction that you've basically won the game. Being able to destroy all cards on your opponent's side of the field is pretty good. Being able to do that in addition to their hand is even better, because there aren't really cards in the game that can just get rid of your opponent's entire hand. That is like the rarest effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! And also just one of the strongest. And since the modern metagame is all about negating your cards anyway, wouldn't it seem like this card is kind of overpowered? Well, the problem with this card, and why it doesn't work very well, is mainly tied to the fact that it's a trap card. You see, since this card is a trap card, it's not usable on your first turn or going second, which is usually when the most amount of negates are happening. So this card is something that would be very good during your first turn, which is not usable until your next turn, which immediately takes it out of the running for a lot of decks. Because if you want your combos to go off uninterrupted, you basically have to wait a whole turn before being able to set Witch's Strike if you want to use it in retaliation for something getting negated, in which case you're probably going to lose by that point since you didn't actually do anything. If you're just setting it because you play a whole bunch of control trap cards in the first place, chances are you're trying to stop your opponent from getting out monsters which can negate, or you're playing a whole bunch of floodgates where you don't really get your stuff negated in the first place. And there are a lot of modern cards which don't negate activations, simply the effects of cards. 2 of the most popular hand traps in the game are Ash Blossom and Joy Spring and Infinite Impermanence, and neither of the negates from these cards can activate Witch's Strike, since they don't specifically negate the activation of a card, they negate the effects, which is a difference that matters. Ash Blossom and Joy Spring won't proc Witch's Strike, but Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion will, because it does negate the activation. Sword Soul Master will not proc the effect of Witch's Strike, but Barone will. So it's kind of an awkward card to use because there's lots of negates in the game which don't actually negate the activation of cards and only their effects. So realistically, even having the option of activating Witch's Strike itself is kind of hard, as most of the time if your opponent is able to get up a board of negates, they'll probably have at least one other negate to then negate the effect of Witch's Strike, since it's just a normal trap card which happens after the negate takes place and not during the chain. So if Witch's Strike was a quick play spell card, it would actually be really good. The fact that you have to wait a turn in order to maybe use it means it's not likely to be resolved outside of very specific types of decks, just because of how important the first couple of turns are, and how bad trap cards are which have incredibly specific triggers, since they're usually so vulnerable to being destroyed by your opponent's destruction effects. However, if you do resolve the effect, you probably win. So it's a nice gimmick with a situational effect that comes up a lot more often than other gimmicky cards, to the point where it might see competitive play someday, depending on certain specific trap synergies or support that might be released in the future. And at number 3, we have Mirror Force. This is a trap card which can only be activated when your opponent declares an attack, where you then get to destroy all attack position monsters your opponent controls. Now, there is a card in the game called Lightning Storm, which has an effect that can only be activated if you control no face-up cards, and allows you to either destroy all face-up attack position monsters your opponent controls, or destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. And Lightning Storm is an absolute staple card that sees all kinds of competitive play in both the main and side deck, whereas Mirror Force does not, despite sharing the same effect of being able to destroy all your opponent's attack position monsters. And the reason for that is because it's a trap card which can only be activated during the battle phase from a specific trigger by your opponent. And the same reason Witch's Strike and Dances with Beasts is not very good kind of applies to Mirror Force, in that trap cards kind of have to be usable whenever in order to see competitive play, and most of the time even then they're too slow and they need to be usable from the hand immediately if they're going to actually see widespread competitive play. And because, as I mentioned earlier, the metagame is more about destroying your opponent's board before attacking, rather than building up a huge board and then attacking. Usually, a deck won't enter the battle phase until after they've already destroyed all your opponent's cards, so Mirror Force is just way too vulnerable to survive to the battle phase, even though the effect is technically good. The effect of Mirror Force does have a history of competitive play, but not really in the modern game. The power level of Mirror Force is probably a little bit higher than the rest of the cards on this list, but it's definitely a new player trap that seems a lot better than it really is. Although I can't really think of a better new player trap than the next two cards on this list. And at number 2, we have Magic Cylinder. This is another battle trap which can only be activated when your opponent declares an attack, just like Mirror Force, except its effect is that it simply negates the attack of the monster, then inflicts damage to your opponent equal to that monster's attack. So, if your opponent is attacking with something like a number 100 Numeron Dragon that has 9,000 attack, then you can reflect all of that damage back to your opponent and win the game. Or if your opponent is attacking with some other big attacking monster and they're low on life points, this can kinda steal you the game with the massive amount of effect damage it deals. Although, here's why this card isn't very good. This situation, and when this card can single-handedly win you the game, are incredibly situational and niche at best, and not really worth playing a main deck card for. So in all other situations and normal situations, monsters will not have more than 8,000 attack, and all you're doing in those normal situations is stopping a single attack by going -1 in card advantage, and while having a vulnerable battle trap on the field the whole time. Dealing damage to your opponent's life points is not really worth anything unless that's the whole point of your deck. And even most burn decks don't play Magic Cylinder because it's too reliant on your opponent performing an action, and they'd rather play other burn cards that can be chained immediately to your opponent trying to clear your back row. And being able to stop a singular attack is also not a good effect, unless you're able to do it incidentally through some other amazing effect. Because even using a card to stop an entire battle phase like Threatening Roar is not worth playing unless the point of your deck is trying to stall out. And even Threatening Roar isn't considered a very good card anymore. Same with Scrap Iron Scarecrow, which can stop one attack every turn while not losing any card advantage. And that's mainly the problem with Magic Cylinder. It's too hard to trigger because it has to survive to the battle phase, and both of its effects are not really worth playing the card, since there are other better ways to deal burn damage, and there are better ways to stop a singular attack, which don't really see play because neither of those things are very important. And at number 1, we have Magical Mallet. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can shuffle any number of cards from your hand back into your deck and then draw the same number of cards. And on surface level, this card seems very good, as it allows you to basically mulligan your hand, and a choice of returning singular cards rather than returning everything like what Reload does. However, you may be surprised to hear, but Reload is actually better in certain circumstances and has seen more play than Magical Mallet because it has some combo potential with certain cards. But the reason Magical Mallet is not as good as you would think is because it's an inherent -1 in card advantage. You see, whenever you count the amount of advantage a card has, you have to also count the fact that the card is going to go to the graveyard after you use it. That's why something like Pot of Greed is considered a +1, even though it lets you draw 2 cards. That's because the card advantage is counted to the fact that you're losing the card from your hand in order to draw 2. So, while being able to reset choice cards from your hand in order to redraw them is actually a very good effect, having to go -1 in card advantage to do it is generally not worth it, because card advantage is everything in the game. Having to play a specific card in your deck that you have to specifically draw into to have a chance to reset a dead hand is just not worth playing that card, especially since you're basically planning for a failure stage, rather than trying to plan for a way to advance the game state. I've had many streams where people would come on and suggest that I add Magical Mallet in order to deal with garnets that I draw into my deck, as of course a garnet is a card that you never want in your hand and you want to stay in your deck. And it is the ideal card in order to potentially deal with a garnet. But that's playing a card in order to only deal with garnets, and taking a loss in card advantage that could be used on literally anything else that could actually advance the game state. You could instead play something like Evenly Matched to single-handedly win you the game, Dark Ruler No More to turn off all of your opponent's negates, or even an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring to stop a key search. You have to compare this one Magical Mallet, which is only planning for a failure state, to all of these other very game-changing staples that could instead help you actually win the game. All while most of these other staple cards trading evenly, or even netting you advantageous card advantage, instead of a guaranteed -1 like what Magical Mallet will always be. Really, the easiest way they could fix the card for Magical Mallet to be as good as people think it is to change its effect to draw the same number of cards you return to your deck +1. Which is exactly what they did with some archetype-specific Magical Mallets like Ignite Reload, which allows you to shuffle back Pendulum monsters from your hand to your deck, then draw the same number of cards +1. Or even Sekka's Light, which allows you to return a singular card from your hand to your deck and draw a card, but it does so from the graveyard, so you don't lose any card advantage. So there are cards which have good effects similar to Magical Mallet, but the only good ones that do don't lose you any card advantage for doing so. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards that seem really good but are actually not that good that I may have missed? Or do you have ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, I'd love to hear about those things down in the comments.